Hi, folks. So hi to everyone who's online at this point, and as folks join in. My name is Gautam Bhan. I'm one of the faculty as part of the STSN MOOC, and many of you will have seen two of the lectures that I did in the past couple of weeks on gender and on housing. So just a quick sense of what I do and where I come from, so that you have a sense of what we'll talk about for the next hour. My core work is as an urban sociologist and a planner. My doctorate is in urban studies and planning. And the core focus of my work is in thinking about questions of inequality and poverty in contemporary cities. My work has been largely focused on Indian cities. I taught in the US for several years as well. And the questions that concern me are thinking a little bit about particularly how cities of the global south produce and reproduce regimes of poverty and inequality. And I've done some of this work focusing on looking at this question through housing and thinking of housing as a key site of that reproduction. And equally, however, in the lecture on gender, you'll have seen that I'm equally interested in thinking about how such inequality is not just material or economic more narrowly, but is structured in ways that are deeply social and cultural processes. And gender is just one example that we could have taken in terms of thinking about identity, inequality, and question. So we'll take questions as they're coming in and talk through. I've got one by Shali Gupta. So let me read the question to you. I would like to know what is the state of rental housing in India for housing the poor, and has the government been looking at rental housing as an option to solve the problem? So I think this is a really actually interesting question. And I think that one of the big underappreciated debates in the Indian housing context has been one on rental. The history of our housing policies have been very ownership-centered. We've had very much an idea that the idea of housing policy is to give a house through a very narrowly understood sector of ownership. And I think that this has hampered us in any way. Our public data tells us that anywhere between 30 and 40% of our housing is actually rented. Now, this is much lower, say, than continental Europe, where the numbers can be between 60 and 80%, but much higher than, say, contexts like North America, where the number is on the lower end. So in somewhere in the middle, even underestimated numbers of rentals show that a third of people are already renting. And they're renting across income classes. And I think that's very important to understand. So when the Census of India counts rental within the slum, for example, if you take that category at its word for a minute, the rental rates remain between 35 and 45%, which means that rental is an income strategy and a housing strategy across income classes in a very interesting way in India. We have not significantly grappled with rental housing. We have had experiments at particular times in looking at rental housing by employers and by some public agency. Calcutta in the 1970s is a good place to look. Bombay in the 1980s is a good place to look. But of late, particularly in the last 20 years, rental housing has not seen a lot of attention. This is beginning to change. So there is an excellent 2015 committee headed by someone called Jethirath Rao that gave a ministry-level output on pushing rental housing as a housing equity strategy in India that has been taken quite seriously. And what you're seeing now is that central housing policy allows the use of public funds and housing policy funds to make public rental housing. I think that the nature of mobility and migration in Indian cities and the nature of the deep affordability gap in our housing markets means that rental is actually the only viable strategy at scale in order to bridge the generational move between when wages will rise enough for people to be able to afford adequate housing legally in the market. So I think that there is a new national draft rental policy that has been set up, and we have not yet begun to see where it will go. But certainly I think that when you point to rental, it is a very, very, very key strategy that is particularly important in a particular kind of city, which are cities where the general income distribution of most residents means that they will not be able to afford to enter the housing market within their generation. And in India, that number is somewhere between 60 and 70%. So we have a deeply skewed housing market where the minimum floor to entry is very, very high. It's far beyond the lifetime incomes of most urban residents, which means some sort of transition. Currently, that gap is met through illegality. It's met through occupation and auto-constructed housing. But that gap could be met in a much stronger way through rental. So we can talk more about that if you want to add a question or follow up, but let me use that as a kind of opening salvo. All right, second question by Vaishali Wadbude. My apology if I'm mispronouncing your name. My question here is, how can we achieve gender equality in context to Indian society? All right, this is the million-dollar fight. Let me say this. I think that one of the first steps that we have to do is to recognize that in the last 30 years, principally because of the struggles of the feminist and women's movements in India, we have finally begun to actually take on the full extent of the gender and patriarchy question. For a long time, we were deeply underestimating and not directly taking on questions of what it meant to have a very strongly patriarchal society. And when we spoke of them in fractures. For example, one whole debate was on sexual violence, and all questions of gender inequality were about violence. A second debate was about economic inequality, or gender inequalities and indicators to basic human development, like literacy gaps, wage gaps, income gaps. But we were never able to hold together all the different ways in which the social manifestations of patriarchy, its economic consequences, its life and developmental opportunity limitations were self-reinforcing each other. Let me give you one example. India has one of the lowest rates of female workforce participation in the world. Right? And one of the big challenges we have here is to understand why, despite rising education, more Indian women are not working. And at this point, there is no other set of battles we have to take on than conceptions of what it means for women to work, what it means for the status of families, notions of tradition and honor and shame, notions of women's mobility and safety and opportunity, and persistent notions of labor market discrimination. You have to put those together. So what I think we have to do to think about gender inequality is to begin to speak about it in a more systemic way, so that one doesn't have parallel conversations saying, as long as public violence or sexual violence goes down, battle's won. As long as economic gaps narrow, battle's won. We have to see how they're connected to each other. And we have to make the conversation more public, we have to make it more central, and we have to make it more primary. I do think we're moving in this direction. I think that one of the things that you cannot escape so much right now in India is a public gender debate. Every move has a counter question. Let me link this to the next question that's come up, which is to say, in light of the recent Bangalore mass molestation report, what do you think we can do to make our cities safer for women? And this is by Chirag Malkani, who seems to be in Bangalore, Delhi, and Puerto Rico all at once, so which is an enviable life, I would say. So, Chirag, I think that this goes back to that question. If the symptom that we are seeing is a question of public violence against women in the city, what is the question we must ask? How do we work backwards from there? I think that there are many ways in which we can think about the question of women's safety. But the one very important one is to fight the kind of reaction that came from the police in some quarters in Bangalore. Let me give some folks some context of what happened. There was a case in Bangalore on New Year's Eve of a public incident of sexual harassment and sexual abuse, which is what I think we'll call it. And it was in one of the city's primary downtown streets. And one of the questions that was asked, and lest we think of this only as Bangalore, let me remind you the recent case in Germany, in Cologne, that happened exactly the same a few months ago on a celebration night. When we think a little bit about how should we ask that question about safety? I think one of the problems in the Indian context, to be specific to here, is that we tend to speak about safety still in the language of protectionism, right? The questions that are asked are, women must be safe, and the language you often hear is that they must be protected. There's questions of honor. They are, the invocation is they are sisters and mothers, and there is a question of morality and virtue that is invoked. I think that what would be very useful is to think a little bit about other language that is coming from the feminist movement, by the work of people like Shilpa Phadke, for example, who speak not about safety, but about the women's right to be in public space and also take risk. The program that I would highly encourage you all to read through is something called Why Loiter. And I think this is very important, because as long as safety is reduced to keeping women safe from violence, as long as they act a certain way, then safety is very easily reduced and misrecognized, misread, I would say, to fit neatly into a very patriarchal sense of honor, right? So you don't have to, if, when you talk about safety for men, I don't have to be someone's son or brother to deserve to be safe. I'm simply an individual. But the language of safety in the Indian context very easily goes into appropriate behavior. So therefore, the police reaction in Bangalore saying westernized women with a certain attire at night, drinking, celebrating, almost quote unquote asked for it. Now, this is not a Bangalore specific case. This is a universal question of gender where the attention is shifted onto appropriate behaviors of dress, of place, of norms for women, right? Because the burden of appropriate behavior is put on women. So I think it's very important that as we speak about very concrete strategies, yes, better public spaces, more eyes on the street, better policing, thinking about everything from streetlights to mixed use. You are also very much talking about the changing discourse where we think about women as having the right to be in public space at all times, in the day, in the night, on their own terms. And I think we have to have both of these discussions happen together. Because until women are owning and present in public space, there will always be uninvited interlopers. There will always be targets for violence. And I think that in many ways that what a lot of women are saying is don't tell us how to be, where to be, when to be. It is your job to protect the risk that we wish to take. So I think that, in Delhi post 2012, after an incident of a very strong case of sexual violence that became to be known as the Nirbhaya rape case, it was the same set of demands. It was a demand to say that women will not choose between safety and freedom. You will not choose a restriction on your liberty and your mobility in order to be more free. And I think the reaction to the Bangalore case has been very telling because it hasn't made that distinction important. And that's partly why we're in the place in the first place. I think very fundamentally, we're looking for short-term solutions like lighting, surveillance, policing, etc. Doesn't address the structural problem where we are societally still not able to accept the right of women to be in public space on their terms as they choose. And somewhere we have to begin to take that on. Safety and violence is the symptom. It's not the root of the structural problem. Okay, so I've got a question here saying, how can urban planners work with the government to influence policy and make the women in India feel less vulnerable? And so by Chirag as well. Again, Chirag, I would say that I think that, the question of women's safety is very much a public question that all of us have to take on. I don't think that something like safety, politics, and power can be negotiated through policy alone. We can't dictate equity. We can be better at responding to complaints. We can be better at deterrence. We can have zero tolerance for harassment. We can have better responsive law and order systems. But nowhere in the world, I think, has any law and order system, no matter how powerful, been able to instill a sense of respect and nonviolence among citizens who don't consider themselves equal. So the question of women's safety cannot be reduced to a policy design question. No one has that silver bullet. It is a daily public fight of all of us as citizens engaging with each other and calling out why it is that violence against women in the Indian city today is normalized. It's routine, it's made ordinary, it's made banal in many ways. And that's partly because we have a structural question of not valuing and treating men and women as equal beings in public space. So I don't think we can reduce this just to working with the government or working with policy. We have to work with each other on every scale. So this is why this work is so difficult, because in some senses, it's not public, it's deeply private work, it's intimate work. It's work in our homes, it's work with our brothers and our sisters and our friends and our mothers, it's work in our communities, it's work with our friend circles, it's work in our own cities. And a lot of it is work that is small and incremental and difficult conversations, because we're really calling out patterns of entrenched and historical inequality that have to be done. But everyone is having those fights. And that's, I think, the really interesting part of what's happening, that we're beginning to move on in many kinds of ways. Okay, so I've got a question by Purvi Bhat saying developers are trying to qualify servant quarters and high-end housing as part of their obligation for low-income or economically weaker section housing in large developments. Although this would have lots of merits, is this acceptable? By Purvi Bhat. Purvi, this is a very good question. So in context for folks who aren't familiar with the Indian scenario, what Purvi is referring to is a planning reservation by which a certain percentage of built housing units in any new development is reserved to what in Indian government lingo is called economically weaker sections. But you have parallels through this across the world. It's usually called some notion of inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, where even private developments are asked to have a mix of uses. In Spain, inclusionary zoning can go up to 50% of units and of area in new housing projects. In Singapore, the zoning is not even just across class, but also across race. So actually every housing unit, public or private, that is built has a strict distribution of Singapore's 4 major ethnic communities in order to think about spatial and ethnic distribution. So inclusionary zoning and that question of how one balances it is again a global method. I think in the Indian case, what has happened is that when we restrict that inclusionary zoning, not to city master plan land areas, but to single projects, particularly real estate projects, then these kinds of workarounds, and really it's a workaround where you build small worker housing that's then really treated as housing for domestic workers and then is passed off as poor housing. These kind of workarounds begin to come. I think the distinction here is this: the fact that that housing stock exists is good. The fact that it's restricted to domestic workers is not. Because the point of that housing is that it cannot come with the condition of employment. It cannot be seen as an addendum to the house itself. And in the Indian cultural context, the servant quarter, as it's called, and that name should tell you enough about the way it's seen politically and culturally, is seen as part of your property, as the employer of the domestic worker in the house. It is seen as linked to you, and very often in these cases, the legal property rights are not given to the resident, but are seen as housing that is provided as part of employment. In that case, it actually violates the policy in and of itself. If you build smaller units and you transferred ownership to those residents, assuming even that for some period of time they may work locally as domestic workers, I would have less of a problem with that. Because that would mean that even if they left that employment and chose to do something else, the housing was very much theirs. So the problem with passing off domestic work housing as low-income housing to meet project reservations is that that housing is then reduced to an employment entitlement and adds to the property value of the main house owner, is not seen as independent, freestanding, low-income housing as the reservation imagines it to. So I would say it actually is something that should not be allowed. If it's allowed, it must be mandated with full property title transfer, in which case most developers would not do it. And I think that's when you see that they would not do it with that change, you know that they're using it as a workaround. They're not using it in any genuine way to meet an inclusionary housing mandate. Okay, so Krishna Priya's question is following Purvi's question. It says there's a serious glitch in the definition of housing when we use area as the primary tool, making it too developer-oriented. And in lieu of demonetization, do we have an opportunity to redefine it? Okay, so I think that one of the things that I was trying to communicate in the lecture quite strongly is the distinction between housing and the house. And I think the minute we stop thinking of housing as the unit, then the question of norms and standards and adequacy of that unit become secondary questions to us. I think you're absolutely right that our housing policies and housing policies in much of the world have actually been very centered on what unit to deliver. The fight then becomes about 22 square meters versus 25 square meters versus 27 square meters. And it actually misses multiple points about what makes housing viable, affordable, adequate, and desirable to residents. Right? So for example, it completely misses the link between houses as spaces of work. It completely misses the link between houses and incremental movement for growing families, etc. So I think that you're absolutely right to say that the obsession, I wouldn't say it's just that the area is the primary definition. I think the problem is that the unit is the primary mode of delivery. We don't think in terms of settlements and locations and infrastructure levels. We think in terms of unit sizes. And so it becomes a kind of factory line as imagination of how to fix the housing problem by delivering these built units in a form that will close our housing gap, despite any evidence to show that we can. Unfortunately, in the minute you make it that fixed housing unit that's already fully built, versus an auto-constructed increment unit that is built by people and residents themselves, but built slowly over time, then to use your language, it becomes very developer-oriented. Because it is the developer who thinks of the housing unit as a complete unit that is delivered straight as one fixed, completed box, as opposed to housing that is incrementally built over time as the household's wages increase. So absolutely, the focus on the unit and the reduction of housing to the house certainly puts us in a place that makes it very developer-oriented. Demonetization, which for some of you may not know, which is India's recent move to make its old 500 and 1,000 rupee notes invalid legal tender and replace them with new notes. That move has not, to my knowledge, given us an opportunity to make that much of a dent in thinking about housing, unfortunately. I'm not, maybe you can say a little bit more about why you think it would have. But I think our problem right now in our policy is that we've made a move away from upgradation-based approaches that focus on improving services and settlement in neighborhoods into the delivery of housing units. And in this kind of standardized ground plus 3, ground plus 5 model, partly because it's easier to count, it's easier to contract, it's easier to deliver. But the question of whether it's actually sustainable and viable is very much a question. Let's not forget that the previous housing policy also tried to build some large amounts of fixed 25 square meter units. And at the end of the last urban renewal mission, all our data indicated to us that the occupancy rates of those new houses were nowhere above 30 to 40%. Now that's telling us something about us delivering housing that people don't want. And to use the language of the lecture, it's telling us something about people thinking about housing that is not, that may be adequate and may even be affordable, but is certainly not viable. And I think the combination of those affordable, adequate, and viable are very important to keep in mind. Okay, so Sirajul Islam is asking, how is the idea of putting slums in cities on the map? Is it a necessity now? Giving each home in the slum an identity, maybe a zip or a postal address, will it empower slum dwellers? It's an interesting question. I think globally you have two kinds of experiences. One is the work of places like Slum Dwellers International, the Asian Commission for Human Rights, movements in India like the Slum Dwellers Federation, who used self-survey and self-enumeration, where people measured and created surveys of their own residents, geolocated their slums, took photographs in front of their houses as a testimony of presence. We are here, we belong, there is address, we must be mapped. I think the tension between mapping slums is two ways. Mapping is a technology, but it can be agnostic to its ends. So you can easily be mapped in order to be evicted. You can also be mapped in order to be legalized and improved. And so the mapping technology cannot be separated from the political fight for legitimacy, especially around housing that is either built in some tension with law and formal master plans. So in many ways, in the Indian context specifically, for example, when you think about schemes like the Rajiv Awas Yojana, the last urban policy, it insisted that all slums in the city be mapped. It began with the preamble of thinking about counting all residents and trying to include them. It had a very inclusive language, regardless of its implementation in many ways. There, I think mapping can be a potentially emancipatory strategy. But equally, we have many examples of mapping being a deeply exclusionary strategy. So say you have a household with a slum with 100 households. Very often, government surveys that will come in will map 60 or 65 or 67, very rarely 100. Now, that is also a case of surveying and mapping that creates divides within communities. So I think that mapping has to be understood completely embedded into the process by which it's done, the intent by which it's done, and the power that mapping wields. It can be used as a tool of resistance and mobilization by communities. It can also be used as a tool of deep state power. And I think that those are, so it really depends on context. And I think we can't take mapping and technology's role at face value. We have to locate it in those political processes. But I've certainly been seen it used in both ends. I will say one thing, that in the new policy landscape in India, mapping has become a bit of an inevitability, which means that the idea of mapping and having GIS maps for most cities that map all slums has been something that has been institutionalized. So in some ways, the game you could play in the 70s and 80s, where you tried to just avoid the attention of the state and didn't get counted while you grew, that game is no longer as easily available to people. Because in some senses, the state is out to map you. They're making lists. They're thinking about different kinds of ways of putting information. Information and data have become key points of policy debate. So the ability to be under the radar, to be slightly invisible, to control how much visibility you have, that power has been lost in some senses by low income and slum communities. So now they're trying to engage with mapping in a different way. They're trying to control it. They're trying to put their own maps up front. They're trying to contest state narratives. So in some ways, the battle has changed around us on mapping. So it's a good question. I think it pulls us in many different kinds of ways. Okay, so Deepthi is asking, what do you think about the mismatch in the housing sector? There are more houses in supply for higher income strata, while the demand is mostly from the low income group. You're absolutely right. So this is what I was calling the skew in our housing market. You can call it a disjunct, you can call it a break, you can call it a deep inequity. You can call it a structural mismatch, you can call it a bias. People have called it many different things. So let's think about how we read this mismatch. What we're saying here is that the Indian government uses a 5:1 ratio for affordability, right? Which means that you can afford a house that is 5 times your annual income. What we're looking at is that most of the housing, in most of our cities, the average house that most people can afford to buy by the 5:1 ratio is about 10 lakhs, right? Which is our metric, the Indian metric of lakh, which is 100,000, right? So it would be, so 10 lakhs comes to, I think, 1 million rupees. Sorry, I'm very bad with this million lakh thing. So a lakh is 100,000, 10 lakhs is 1 million. So what you think about that, though, is that when you think about most of the legal adequate housing stock in our cities, it's much higher than 10 lakhs. One quick snapshot and a way to see this is to look at loans for formal housing by the National Housing Bank. The National Housing Bank tells us that less than 12% of all loans that are given by housing finance companies, public commercial banks, private banks, remember they're all regulated by the NHB. You can't be a housing finance company without that regulation. So this is a universal sample. Only 12% of the loans are under 10 lakhs. Right? Now that means that most of your loans are between 10 lakhs and up. And most of them, a solid 50% of them, are actually above 25 lakhs, which shows you the huge skew. The demand mostly is for housing under 10 lakhs, which is unmet, which is where the adequacy affordability debate goes. The loans are all above 10 lakhs. So we have a very strong mismatch in our housing sector, which also means that the current equilibriums we have with the market working as it is are not going to deliver equity, which means some kind of intervention is required. And the question then we should debate is, what is this intervention? Do we, for example, take on vacancy? You're right. We have, our numbers tell us that 18 million houses are short and 9 million houses are vacant. This is true of many cities in the world. I remember being in Cairo a few months ago, and I was struck tremendously by the enormous amount of vacant housing stock. The challenge is that the housing stock, as you're saying, tends to be the result of speculation in an unregulated market. So it tends to be a much higher income vacancy. But we don't quite know this because our data does not tell us how to break up this 9 million vacant housing figure. We don't know how much of it is in lower income, middle income, high income. What is the figure? We don't know. We need research that breaks this 9 million vacant houses number down. But the fact of a 9 million vacancy indicates to us that the market needs intervention, it needs regulation, it needs policy. Now, Brazil used a very high vacancy tax to bring back unused stock into the market. That's one policy response to vacancy, to regulating a market. It also used inclusionary zoning to take land off the market and reserve it for affordable housing. So there are multiple ways, whether through direct regulation, through taxation, through land use and planning, through zoning, that you can limit, control, direct the market and say, I'm going to correct this imbalance. I'm going to lower the equilibrium. You have to be determined to do that into the market. The challenge is right now in the Indian political context, regulating the market is seen as anti-growth. It's seen as ideological. It's seen as regressive. That, I think, is a deeply incorrect way to look at it. All markets are regulated. All markets are structured. There is no such thing as a market that is quote-unquote free, right? And I think it's very important to recognize this. We would take land off for heritage. We take land off for environmental purposes. We protect forests. We protect multiple forms of city land and say, yes, you can buy and sell, but not here. We have to extend that to a form of value that says we must regulate the market so that the mismatch between our demand and supply don't shift. You know, I'll give you an example. Everyone in Indian cities wants to be Singapore. In many ways, I would love for our cities to be Singapore. 85% of Singapore's housing was publicly built. and it was built through a regulated market. So Singapore, which is seen as this capitalist, modern, globalized, economically competitive city par excellence, is built on the back of public housing. So there are many ways in which markets have to be regulated to look at supply and demand that shouldn't be seen in a deeply essentialist polarized between left and right, right? Where you're either completely for the state controlling all public goods or completely for the market without restriction. These are both falsehoods that are unproductive. We are in a situation, we have a certain demand profile. That demand profile cannot find legal adequate housing in our cities. That is why we have a range of inadequate and illegal housing in our cities, because people must provide housing. So we must address this skew. We must do it through regulating the market. We must do it through both tax and direct regulation, land use planning, and looking at our land markets. And that requires a mobilization of political will that says that it is unacceptable for a large majority of urban Indians to be excluded from access to a legal, adequate, and viable house. Okay, so the second question is, how does residential segregation affect the housing market? It's a tough question, actually, because I think the question is, when we think about segregation, we have two types of things. You have a natural distribution of inequality in a housing market where people live where they can afford to live, and therefore you have a clustering of higher income, lower income houses. In some cities, that clustering is less severe. Right? So there is a sense in which, you'll say in many Indian cities, okay, you can't ever fully escape, in any way. There's a way in which the rich and poor live next to each other. That was true for our cities for a long time. In many ways, in the last 15 years, residential segregation has deepened and has worsened, and we have to think again about regulatory responses to that. I think the second thing that's very important to note in the Indian context is that we don't have any discrimination protection against private citizens when they exclude other private citizens on the basis of identity. And a very simple example, if you cannot rent a house because you are Muslim, because you eat meat, because you are Hindu, because you are of a particular caste, because you are of a particular gender, because you're a single woman, because you're a Dalit man, because etc. All of those identity matrices in various combinations. In Indian law, if a private citizen refuses to lend you his home, you have no legal recourse. You have no discrimination protection. You can only invoke it if you belong to the lower caste, because you can invoke what is called the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribe Atrocities Act. But outside that, you have no protection. Now, the state cannot do that to you. You can take a public entity to court. A public university's hostel cannot say that to you, but a landlord can. And that's partly because of a case in the Supreme Court out of Bombay that allowed communities to have cooperative housing where they refuse membership to people who are not of their same ethnic or community group. And I think this is a very, very difficult part for us, because we therefore cannot actually measure what discrimination has done to segregation, inequalities in housing in our cities. Anecdotally, we hear this all the time. We hear both income-rich and income-poor Muslims saying that they face deep discrimination in housing. We see housing that is segregated into enclaves on the basis of identity, pre- and post-violence. So the case of Juhapura and Ahmedabad. We see cases of streets that are marked by caste because of deep caste prejudice that forces Dalit and lower caste communities into spatial segregations and ghettos and refuses them a certain housing mobility. And we have not taken nearly seriously enough what identity-based discrimination has done to housing inequality in our cities. And I think it's a very important, underestimated question. We reduce everything to the supply-demand mismatch in the economic analysis, but the economy is infiltrated and built on identity-based behavior. We are not, homo economicus, rational units. So we are very clearly seeing in Indian cities evidence of how prejudice and discrimination block entry to the housing market, even for those who have incomes to afford it. The fact that you have high-income Muslim households living in Juhapura and Ahmedabad is a sign simply of a kind of enforced residential segregation. So I'm glad you brought the question up. And I think it brings together these two questions of identity and housing, the two lectures together very well. And I wanted to emphasize that even though we did that lecture on gender, we could have done it on caste. We could have done it on religion. We could have done it on ability. We could have done it on sexuality. We could have done it on age. I think the larger framework is to not see the market as simply an economic sector, but to see the market as socially and politically constructed, deeply influenced through discrimination and segregation. All right. So Purvi is asking, when rehabilitation is attempted in many cities in India, slum dwellers are found to sell or rent the houses and relocate themselves in other slums or create new slums. Can this be changed? I think that we have to take a look at this. Say the outcome of a slum rehabilitation scheme is that the resident has not lived in the house you gave, but put it on rent and gone elsewhere. How do you read this action? I would say, in one sense, if you were a good private company, you would say, let's, for example, I'm not saying we should think of people in housing look as consumers, but let's play this example. You would say, consumer behavior is telling me that people don't want what I'm selling. I give it to them, they sell it off, they don't use it. And you would say, like a good person who wants to sell a product, you would say, what is wrong in what I'm giving? Why are people not keeping what I'm giving them? Unfortunately, when it comes to housing policy, we expect, in a sense, that the poor will act like grateful consumers who will take whatever we get regardless of it. What the poor are doing, what income poor households are doing, is they're making absolutely good, economically rational choices. They're doing cost benefit. They are weighing the cost of the viability of the location of these houses, their potential, their income potential, and they are, remember, making trade-offs in whether their primary investments are for housing or for other family needs. This is something that we have to understand when we speak of housing. Households are not constantly thinking about how to improve their unit. Households are making multiple decisions, just like us, that's like all other households, constantly. So I'll give you an example. One survey in India that is very powerful showed that when you give extra income to low-income households, the first investment is in putting one child, unfortunately, typically the boy, in an expensive English-speaking private school. The second is to overcome 4 types of expenses: funerals, weddings, hospitalizations, and deaths. Right? So what you're seeing is that on that list, when extra income was gotten, an opportunity was gotten, money went into housing improvement only on a 4th or 5th priority. So we also have to recognize that low-income households are seeking to put intergenerational mobility into their frames. They are making choices. They're not going to necessarily make economic decisions the way we want them to make, because they are making complex trade-offs in where they want to invest. If they are saying, we would rather live in a poor temporary slum house near work and get on with it so that one of our kids can go to a rich private school and therefore go to college and therefore earn 40,000 rupees a month in a call center and then lift us out, that is a rational economic decision. So I think that the decision to say, how can we make slum dwellers stay where we want them to stay, actually disrespects them. It patronizes them. We have to begin and say, these are the incentives that people are acting on. How do we align? How do we align the kind of trade-offs they are making? How do we better understand this economic behavior? We have to give equal respect to their economic decisions as we would give to middle-class households. We would never question a middle-class household's decision to buy a property, rent it, and live in a smaller flat in the center of the city. We would see it as just different economic priorities. I think it's very much the same for the poor. Okay, the one thing I will say about this also, though, and immediately, the minute you have rehabilitation housing that is in any way disconnected with the location of employment, then the sell-off is guaranteed. Because let's remember one thing very clearly. Housing location decisions as you go down the income ladder are determined by employment, not by the quality of the housing unit. So people will constantly give up better quality housing to be closer to work. Now, if you had different transport systems, that choice matrix will change. So again, I think the question for us is, how do we understand the economic trade-offs and decisions that low-income households make? How can we align ourselves with their actions so that they have incentive to stay in the houses that we are building, where we are building them, rather than puzzling our heads over saying, why are 70% of our built houses unoccupied? Because clearly they may be adequate and affordable. Remember the third, they are not viable. And we have to think about what that means. Okay, so Vaishali is asking, how does demand and supply ratio for housing can be achieved fairly for every income group? As we see, the demand for LIG is not met, but surplus of HIG housing is prevailing. That's right. I think we have to first, as I was saying earlier, we have to first acknowledge this. We don't currently acknowledge it. We currently speak about the housing market as if it functions objectively, neutrally, fairly, according to principles of economics. We actually have to turn around and say, this market is skewed. It's broken, there is market failure, and it is unequal. Once we acknowledge that, the debate will shift to say, how do we address where there is surplus and vacancy and where there is underbuilt housing? Now, all of those follow with political kinds of commitments in thinking about how to prioritize the housing shortage is something that has to be fixed. Currently, let me be very frank with you, in our political system on policy, we actually think that we can get away with this housing shortage because income poor urban Indians are seen to be resilient. As we say in a lot of Indian languages, jugaad se chal jayega. Right? People will get by, people will adjust, people will improvise. And we are now taking that resilience and basically making the poor responsible for their own survival. It has become, the burden has completely shifted on them. So I think that one of the big questions about thinking about how we can achieve them fairly for every income group, we first have to begin from where we are and say there are particular income groups that have been treated the most unfairly. And we have to begin with regulation that addresses that imbalance. Then we can think about questions of balancing out the market. At this point, we are so far from a balanced housing market that we have to take very strong regulations to intervene and structure it, which we are afraid to do, partly because the political economy of our cities is telling us right now, make your city more competitive, attract investment, give more subsidies, give land to IT parks, to economic zones. No one is telling our policymakers, take your public land and give it to low-income housing. We're saying, take your public land, monetize it and raise capital. Those are two very contradictory decisions that we are giving under our development paradigm. So we've got to change the way we speak about our priorities as urban development first. The market reflects our political priorities. It doesn't create them. Okay, so what are we doing next? Deepthi is asking, adding to Purvi's question, women in the slums at the houses provided with the bathroom are easy to sell and rent. Is it not better that houses are given according to their need? I think it is. And I think that, so the challenge I'm going to put forth to you guys as you become practitioners or speak to policymakers, here's a debate you'll have, the debate I always have inside the government. You will say, we need to customize and make housing according to need, including design. We have to shift it by state, shift it by region. The bureaucrats will turn back and say, it is impossible to track 25 designs. Give us 4 models because they're the only way we can deliver it at scale. And everything else you do will lead to corruption. What will be your response to this challenge? And I think this is where, as practitioners, we have not thought far enough. We know that we want nuance and multiple models and every process to be participatory, but we have no way to convince the bureaucracy that this is implementable at any kind of scale, right? So when the bureaucrats look at us and say, but I want model A, B, C, and D, and they can say it with bad intentions, they're trying to get out of work, good intentions, because they are saying, in our experience, if we don't lock down the models and define them, there will be corruption, there will be shortcuts. Right? Because the problem is, from far, innovation in multiple design and flexible design also looks like corruption. When you cheat on design and don't build what has to be built. It's very hard to tell when one is nuancing and innovating for good and when one is doing it to be corrupt. So until we can find processes where this nuance and customization can be scaled and delivered at the volumes we're talking about, we'll win the theoretical point, but we'll never translate any of what we're saying into practice. So how do we challenge ourselves as practitioners to convince the bureaucrats that you don't have to standardize and turn everything into rule-based models and deliver one type of house in 3 ways across the state? How do we build that capacity in the system? I don't have an answer for this. We've struggled deeply in both Karnataka and Delhi in my work in the last 5 years and thinking about how to convince them. And I take their objections very seriously because I think many of them are very well-meaning and saying, give me another way to do it and I will do it. But I can't leave it undefined. I have to define it. The minute you define it, design according to needs struggles. So we have to think about that challenge very carefully. So Shelley is saying, will it be correct to say that the 5-year government term is a big reason for the lack of political will to get into public housing, as the process of providing housing is a very long-term process? So obviously there is the tension of saying, how do we have continuity, right? Because if every scheme turns every time a new government comes in, then we have an issue. I wouldn't put, I hesitate to put too much on this 5-year process. I mean, we're not dissimilar from the rest of the world on this. No one does much longer than 5 years. And I think that the other systems are ways of continuity that we also have, but don't work. I think that if there is an intention, Really? I mean, if you just look at our recent history, we had the UPA government in for 10 straight years. They had time. And in some ways, they were able to do more things. In some ways, they weren't. But this government, as Aadhaar, for example, has found a way to be continuous throughout the governments and continues to deepen. Narega has found a way to do the same. So I think that while the break in the 5-year cycle is difficult, it also has advantages. So I'm not quite sure. It's a complicated question. I think you could argue it either way. I don't think it's that primary reason for the discontinuities in our policy. I think actually the discontinuities in our policy is because we don't have good systematic ways to think through them, and we don't have good public political debate about them. I think those are more important reasons than the 5-year cycle. Okay, Sirajul is asking, can neutral policies on gender be discriminatory? Can you say a little bit more, Sirajul, on this question? I'm not quite sure I understand it. Maybe I think what you're saying is, can a policy that is gender neutral be discriminatory? I'm still wondering about, just elaborate the question a bit more. I don't want to answer the wrong one. And I'll come back and I'll answer it in a minute. Okay, Mohammed asking whether Housing for All 2022 policy will be successful. Well, that is it's a big question. So look, my personal opinion, I think the policy has some very good things, particularly on the finance side, which I think it does well. The interest rates come down, housing finance should flow to the lower end of the spectrum. But I do think that there are very much some very deep structural problems with this. And I think the fundamental problem with it is that it imagines housing as a housing unit. It's very obsessed with the delivery of the ground plus 3 vertical housing. I see no evidence of our capacity to deliver those at the scale we need. So do I think that Housing for All by 2022 will really address unmet demand? I'm unfortunately going to say no. And I think that, but the good thing about it is that many of us who work closely with the government are trying to get them to rethink some of the guidelines. And I think there's some positive traction. So what I'm hoping is that when the government revises it, it will open itself up to the criticism that's coming from the ground, where we're not able to get projects off the ground because we don't have takers for this kind of vertical housing in the scale that the policy imagines. Okay, so Efiani Odigwe is asking, how do we handle poverty being a mindset order than it being a social classification? This is what frustrates government efforts in upgrading slums, where beneficiaries see it as a passive income generator and relocate to form more slums. Efiani, I think that there is a question here. You're evoking a sort of a long history of debates that enter into the realm of the social psychological questions of poverty. In the 60s, many sociologists wrote about what we call the culture of poverty debates, right? And people like Oscar Lewis in the States talking about saying that somewhere this becomes sort of a mindset. But a lot of people challenge that very powerfully, particularly the myth of marginality by people like Janice Perlman's work, work out of Brazil, that really talked about the argument of taking structural exclusion more seriously than thinking about psychological arguments that could really, in some senses, be very unfair to poor communities, and reduce them in many ways to having internalized the poverty of their conditions. I think sometimes I have seen more evidence of approaches that succeed, like the Ban Mangkong housing program in Thailand that is community-led, that I think it takes time to gain the trust of communities that the object of the housing intervention, including slum upgradation, is not the improvement of the physical environment, not the improvement of the land, not the building of new building stock, but actually the improvement of the lives of the people that are there. And I think this goes back again to the distinction between house and housing. I think what Ban Mangkong, and I encourage all of you to look at this program, Ban Mangkong, Ban in Thai means house, Mangkong means secure, and it's Thailand's largest in-situ upgrading program that was done at scale in the country that helped households move from housing poverty, out of housing poverty in one generation. It was built on the trust of Federation of Community Organizations that actually believed that the process was meant for them. I can speak from the Indian context that most often there is a deep trust deficit in which many times government schemes are seen with a deep suspicion because they believe that the object of the government intervention is not the welfare of the household and the people. It's actually reclaiming, in a Hernando de Soto way, the dead capital in land that is locked under the slum, right? It's a question of redevelopment, it's a question of resettlement, it's not a question of improvement and upgradation. So I think that when you have that kind of trust deficit, it's very easy for communities to look like they are ungrateful or recalcitrant or resisting or passive. I don't think they always are. I think the question really is that we have to call out the trust deficit first. We have to be equally balanced in challenging communities to be partners in engagement, and governments to really put their money where their mouth is and speak in terms of integrated plans that don't seek to just build new houses, but improve people's lives. And where that trust can be built, and I think you have periods in Venezuela under the Favela Barrio, you have periods in Brazil under the improvement programs, you have the Manila experience of Philippines, where that trust has been able to be built for periods of time. You see this question of passive poverty mindset, government interference, frustration, you see them take a back seat. I think they're difficult processes, but it does mean that when we think about slum improvement, before design, before architecture, before planning, we think of processes of trust building and governance and institutional strengthening. And I don't think we do enough of that. We still see very much of our slum upgrading as strategies for spatial redevelopment, as opposed to really thinking about community redevelopment. Okay, so Enrique Cardona is asking, in the USA, people living in public housing keep living through generations. Are they self-segregating from middle-income urban areas? Is welfare dependency not contributing to this behavior? This is actually linked in very much to this question. You know, welfare dependency was a very strong argument in American housing debates in the 80s as well. And I think that what you begin to see somewhere here is a good example of what you're talking about, Enrique, is the struggle of Section 8 voucher programs in Chicago. For folks that may not be familiar with this, the idea of the voucher program was that you would give rent subsidies to households that could move out of neighborhoods and move into other neighborhoods that were better and more integrated. So you would get low-income and mixed-income and middle-income households live together rather than isolate low-income households in public housing projects. And what we found is that many people did not exercise their market right to go move into those households. Many of them spoke at that point, and there's some very good work on why they didn't. And it challenged the idea of welfare dependency and suggested instead that what happened was that many of the ways in which low-income households make their lives work with very low incomes is because they work in communities of care. They work in communities where non-economic transactions, like leaving your children at your neighbors, like borrowing food, like informal credit lines, actually defined life in the projects. That meant that on a couple of $100s a month, you could make a family work. And moving into mixed income neighborhoods where the logic of social life was structured around individual family homes and not around care and resource sharing economies, those kinds of non-quantifiable, non-commercial exchanges began to break down. And families found that even living in better housing could not compensate, because remember, their housing changed, but their wages didn't. So in many ways, I think some of the questions of welfare dependency need to be put against continuing structural exclusions in order to have wage improvements, but also because when we reduce it only to questions of welfare and income, we undercount non-economic care economic practices, resource sharing that make life possible at lower income levels. In your opinion below, Deepti saying, has how FAR, which is floor area ratio, or lower FSI, which is the floor space index. These are both logics that are used in different places in the world, also in India, to measure the relationship to a plot size and how high you can build and how much square foot of building permission you have, for folks who aren't familiar with FAR and FSI. And the Land Ceiling Acts, which is an act that controls how much land individual owners can own, and then beyond the cutoff, land is redistributed. This is to try to flatten the distribution of land holdings. And the illegal housing market, how much so? So Deepti's question is, how far have development controls like floor space index and land ceiling index added to illegality? It's a good question. I think it varies so dramatically by states and cities that there's no one answer to that. I think in Bombay, it's played a huge role. I think you're asking the question from this is a very typically Bombay question. But I think Bombay is quite exceptional. I think in Delhi and Bangalore, you would say very little. And in Delhi, for example, the question was really not zoning enough urban land as the city expanded horizontally. It wasn't about heights. In Bombay, it was absolutely a question about heights, because heights in Bombay were traded. And so in Bombay, development rights, the rights to develop FSI, are traded across multiple schemes. And so therefore there's a deep mismatch between where you build, how much you're allowed to build, and why you got permissions to build what you got to build. So I actually think that in that case, you'd find that most of it may have skewed urban development patterns, but a lot of it is not illegal because of the way we trade FSI and TDR quite legally. So I'm not quite sure about the illegality question. I think a lot of the question is more about the distortions in where we link infrastructure and supply. All right, let me take the last question. The last question is that in India, the estimated cost of a housing project is, say, some X when it was proposed. When it comes to be implemented, it escalates due to inflation. My question is how to tackle these challenges by Mohammad Maazali. You're absolutely right. And it's not just inflation. It's actually delays due to regulatory clearances that lead to deep cost escalations, even when inflation is stable. That's, you can have two things happening. You can have inflation that pushes costs, even in a project that keeps the time. And then you can have cost escalations that are simply the result of regulatory clearances. So the average real estate project in India can take between 11 and 26 months to clear. Now, 11 and 26 months will break the finances of the economics project. This is a debate that the real estate industry has had quite significantly in India. And I think one of the big things you're seeing in many states are rights to contractual service agreements that have come in that are much more enforceable. And what is called the single window clearance. So actually in a lot of the new policies, I encourage you to look, for example, at the Karnataka affordable housing policy. It was just notified in November. There are time-bound commitments to clearing and easing regulatory processes, particularly for mid-sized and small-scale developers that aim to bring down this 13-month gap to about 3 to 6 months. Karnataka has also passed something called Sakala, which is the government act for the right to time-bound delivery of services. Now, in that, specific number of days are given after which the government can actually be taken to court and or penalized. So there is a very big question here on even an economically viable project becomes unviable because of bureaucratic delays in clearing regulations. And I think there was a study I read that there are 26 different clearances that every project has to get, or some big absurd number like that. So I think notions of single window clearances, bundling clearances, assuming clearances until are done later. This is a debate I think that has made some progress. So there's good examples of how to move. All right. We've come to the end of the hour. That was a lot of very great questions. Thank you for bringing them up. I'm sorry that it's sort of been one directional. I'm not quite sure if my answers are satisfactory, and I wish we could engage a bit more. But it's been a pleasure to get a sense of your questions, and I hope it was useful. And take care, and wherever you are, good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, and good luck with the rest of the course. Bye-bye.